The afternoon sun hung low and merciless over Dust Creek, Texas, casting long copper shadows across the dry earth when the Southern Pacific train groaned to a stop at the station. Steam curled from the engine like breath in cold air, though the heat was stifling. Caleb Holt stood at the edge of the platform with his arms crossed, hat pulled low, jaw set the way it always was when he had made up his mind about something he didn't want to do. He hadn't wanted to send for her. That had been his sister May's idea, scrawled in a letter before she left for Kansas City, along with a clipping from a newspaper and a note that read, "You'll thank me someday." He hadn't thanked her. He meant to write back and cancel the whole arrangement, but weeks slipped by the way they always did on a working ranch, and then suddenly there was a reply from a woman named Eleanor Marsh of St. Joseph, Missouri, and then there was a date, and now here he was standing on a platform in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon like a fool waiting for someone he didn't ask for. The passengers stepped off one by one. Caleb scanned the crowd with the practiced eye of a man used to reading land and weather and trouble. He almost missed her. She was small, not fragile exactly, but the kind of small that made the world look too large around her. She carried one suitcase, plain brown leather with a brass clasp that had seen better decades. Her dress was neat but simple. Her hair was pulled back carefully. She looked around the platform with wide, careful eyes, the way a person looks when they are bracing themselves for disappointment. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or the particular unease of two strangers who have already agreed to something enormous. She walked toward him with steady steps, and he found himself straightening without meaning to. "Mr. Holt," she said. Her voice was quieter than he expected. "Miss Marsh," he replied. He glanced at her suitcase, then back at her. "Is that all you brought?" "Yes, sir." He nodded once, looked away toward the street, and said the words he had been rehearsing since morning. "I want to be straight with you. This was a mistake. I'll buy your ticket back." He turned to walk toward the station office. And then he felt it, a small hand closing around his sleeve. He stopped. Her voice came barely above a whisper, and it carried every ounce of something she had been carrying a long time. "Please," she said. "Please don't send me away." Caleb Holt had faced droughts and creditors and 100 hard mornings alone. But those 4 words stopped him cold. He stood with his back to her for a long moment, her fingers still light against his sleeve. He could feel the weight of the platform, the faint sound of the train beginning to pull away, the dry wind that swept dust across the boards beneath their feet. He thought about May, who always believed in things before they made sense. He thought about the ranch, the empty kitchen, the quiet evenings, the sound of his own footsteps being the only sound in the house. He didn't turn around right away. When he did, he looked at Eleanor Marsh the way he looked at land he wasn't sure about, carefully, without sentiment, searching for what was true. Her eyes were dark and direct. She wasn't crying, though her jaw was tight with the effort of not showing more than she already had. She wasn't asking to be saved. She was simply asking not to be discarded before she'd been given a chance. There was a difference, and Caleb, for reasons he couldn't have explained, recognized it. 2 weeks, he said. She blinked. "You stay 2 weeks. You do your part around the place. If it doesn't work, if either of us decides it doesn't work, I'll buy you a fair ticket wherever you want to go." No argument. No debt owed. He held her gaze. "Understood. Understood," she said. Steady. He picked up her suitcase before she could reach for it, not tenderly, just practically, and led her toward the wagon without another word. The ride from town to the Holt Ranch took 40 minutes on a good road. The land opened wide around them, flat and immense, the sky an unbroken blue that seemed to go on longer than reason. Eleanor sat straight on the bench beside him, watching the country roll past. She didn't chatter. She didn't ask nervous questions. She simply looked at the land the way someone looks at something they are trying to memorize. Caleb noticed. He didn't say so. By the time the ranch house came into view, a low, sturdy structure of weathered timber set against a line of cottonwood trees, the sun was nearly down. He showed her the house, her room, where things were kept. Practical. Brief. That night, lying awake listening to the silence, he heard voices outside, low and urgent. He went to the window and saw a rider at the edge of the property, someone he recognized as Hector, a man who worked for the land broker Whitmore, speaking quietly with one of the fence hands. Caleb watched until the rider left. Then he stood there a while longer, thinking. Caleb came down the stairs the next morning expecting the particular kind of quiet that had settled over the ranch house for the past 3 years. Instead, he smelled coffee. Strong, properly made coffee, the kind his mother used to brew before the world rearranged itself. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and found Eleanor already dressed, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, a cast-iron pan heating on the stove. She looked up. "I hope this is all right. I wasn't sure where you kept things, but I found my way well enough." He pulled out a chair and sat down without speaking, which he seemed to take as permission to continue. By the time old Tom came in from the barn, there were eggs, biscuits, and a pot of coffee on the table. Tom stopped in the doorway and stared. "Well," the old man said and left it at that. Over breakfast, Eleanor said very little. But when Tom mentioned the east fence needing restringing before the week was out, she asked practical questions. How much wire, which posts, how far the supply store was. Tom answered, and Caleb watched her make a quiet mental note without writing anything down. After breakfast, she asked if she could look around the property. He told her to stay clear of the far pasture, where the geldings ran when they were being worked. She nodded and went out. He found her 2 hours later at the back of the house, on her knees in the dirt beside what had once been a kitchen garden. It was overgrown now, had been since his mother stopped tending it 4 years before she passed. Eleanor was clearing weeds by hand, methodical and unhurried. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she replied. She sat back on her heels and looked at the bed of soil. "Things grow better when someone pays attention." "I thought I'd try." He left her there. He told himself it was none of his business. That afternoon, a neighbor woman named Mrs. Tate arrived by buggy, ostensibly to drop off a jar of preserves, but in truth she had come to look. She spoke to Eleanor with a particular politeness of someone who has already made up their mind to disapprove. Eleanor answered every question with quiet grace, never defensive, never diminished. When Mrs. Tate finally drove away, Tom caught Caleb's eye and gave a small nod of approval. Later, carrying a pail from the well, Eleanor stumbled on something hard buried just beneath the loose soil of the garden, something solid and hollow sounding. She knelt down and brushed the dirt aside. It was a wooden box, small and weathered, sealed with a tarnished iron latch. She brought it to Caleb at the workbench where he was mending a bridle, set it in front of him without ceremony, and said simply, "I found this in the garden. I didn't open it." He looked at it for a long moment without touching it. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did, a quieting, the way a room goes still when a word is said that can't be unsaid. He picked it up, turned it over once, then carried it inside the house without explanation. Eleanor returned to the garden, asking herself whether she had done something wrong. She decided she hadn't. She had found something that wasn't hers and returned it. That was all. It was Tom who told her that evening, while they worked side by side oiling fence posts near the barn. He spoke in the quiet way of men who have been somewhere long enough to know its whole story. The box had belonged to Caleb's father, Jonas Holt. A good man, Tom said, a fair man, the kind who built a ranch with nothing but time and stubbornness. But in the last years of his life, Jonas had entered a land agreement with a company called Western Range Holdings, believing it would bring water rights to the property. Instead, it had carved off 40% of the original acreage and left a legal knot in the deed that Jonas never fully untangled before he passed. Whitmore was connected to that same company. Different name, same interests. Caleb's been fighting it quiet ever since, Tom said. Doesn't like to speak on it. Feels like defending something that should never have needed defending. Eleanor didn't press for more. She sat with it. At supper that evening, Caleb came to the table instead of eating alone in the study as he had the night before. He sat down, said a short thanks for the food, and began to eat. After a few minutes, he asked where she had learned to cook like this. She told him the Hargrove boarding house in St. Joseph, where she had worked from age 16 until she answered his advertisement. She had cooked for 14 people 3 times a day for 6 years. He nodded. Then, a little later, he asked something else, and she answered, and somehow he ended up telling a story about a horse that had once climbed halfway up the roof of the barn during a storm. She laughed before she could stop herself. Then he almost did. He caught the edge of a smile and pulled it back and looked away. She didn't remark on it, but she filed it away carefully, like something worth keeping. The next morning, the eastern fence had been cut in the night. 3 horses were gone. Caleb was saddled and riding before Eleanor had finished her coffee. She watched him go from the kitchen window, then set down her cup, went to the barn, and saddled the roan mare that Tom had told her was steady and easy with new riders. Tom saw her from the yard and opened his mouth. "I'll be careful," she said, and rode out before he could tell her not to. She caught up with Caleb half a mile east of the property line. He pulled up when he heard hoofbeats and turned with a look that could have stripped paint. "Go back," he said. "I'd rather not." "Miss Marsh." "Eleanor," she said. "And I grew up near the Missouri River bottoms. My father, before he left, took me hunting and fishing every season I can remember. I can read a trail." She looked at the ground, then pointed northwest. "They went that way. See how the scrub is bent? A horse pushes through differently than a man on foot." He stared at her for a moment. Then he turned his horse northwest. They found the trail easily enough once they were looking together. Eleanor tracked the bent grass and disturbed earth with a quiet confidence that surprised even herself. It had been years since she had reason to use what her father taught her, and she hadn't known until now whether she still carried it. She did. The horses were found 2 miles out, tangled in a dry ravine where a section of old fencing had collapsed. They were unhurt but agitated, and it took patience to calm them and lead them out one by one. Caleb handled the 2 difficult ones. Eleanor took the third, a young bay gelding that had worked itself into a state of trembling. She spoke to him low and steady until he stilled, then walked him out of the ravine at an easy pace. On the ride back, Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then, "Where do you say you grew up?" "St. Joseph." "Before the orphanage?" A pause. "How old were you?" 14 when my mother passed. My father had already gone years before." She said it plainly, the way you say things when you have made your peace with them, or at least learned to carry them without showing the weight. "After that, I was placed with families for a while. Then the boarding house took me on. It was honest work. I was grateful for it." He didn't say he was sorry. She didn't want him to. But she felt him listening, and that was something. When they rode back into the yard, a man was standing at the gate, well dressed in town clothes, with a leather satchel under one arm, and the particular manner of someone who believes the land they're standing on ought to be his. His name was Harlan Whitmore, and he shook Caleb's hand with the practiced warmth of a man who made his living convincing other men to give up things they didn't want to give up. He had a square, pleasant face and clean boots, which Eleanor noted meant he hadn't walked far from a buggy. He said he represented a consortium interested in developing a rail corridor through the valley, a project, he explained with great reasonableness, that would bring commerce and prosperity to every landowner in the region. The whole property sat at the center of the proposed route. He was authorized to make a generous offer. Caleb told him no. Whitmore didn't blink. He looked at Eleanor, a brief assessing glance, and said that he understood the situation was complicated, especially for a man managing a property alone. He said that a married couple maintaining an active household has stronger standing in matters of land title. He let that sentence sit in the air for a moment before continuing, and Eleanor understood exactly what he meant by it. After Whitmore left, Caleb stood in the yard for a long time looking at nothing in particular. He didn't speak at supper. He ate quickly and went to the study. That evening, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and the land documents she had noticed stacked on the corner of the study shelf, left in plain sight, not hidden. She reasoned that if he had wanted them private, he would have put them away. She read slowly and carefully, the way Mrs. Hargrove had insisted all her girls learn to read documents, word by word, with no assumptions. She was there until past midnight. What she found was not dramatic. It was a single paragraph in the original deed, written in the careful hand of a county recorder decades ago, a clause of continuous family occupancy that required proof of residence and active use, renewable every decade. The last renewal had been filed by Jonas Holt 11 years ago. If Caleb had no active family claim on record, the clause could lapse. And if it lapsed, the historic protections on the acreage became legally uncertain, exactly the kind of uncertainty a sharp attorney could exploit. She sat with it a while, making sure she had read it correctly. Then she folded the papers neatly, went to the study door, and knocked. He opened it, looking surprised that anyone was still awake. "I found something," she said. "I think you need to see it." His expression shifted when he looked at the page she placed before him. Not panic, something more like the face of a man who has been waiting for a problem to show itself so he can finally look it in the eye. He read the clause twice. Then he sat back in his chair and pressed his knuckles against his mouth, thinking. Eleanor stood across the desk and waited. She had learned in a lifetime of reading rooms and reading people when to let silence do its work. Finally, he said, "How did you find this?" "I read carefully," she said. He looked at her across the desk. Really looked, the way he hadn't fully allowed himself to sense the platform. "The renewal window is 60 days from the anniversary of the original deed," she continued, "which, by the date on this document, is in 41 days. He stood and moved to the window. Outside, the ranch was dark and still, the cottonwood trees moving faintly in the night wind. "If I file the renewal as a single occupant and Whitmore's lawyers challenge the active use language, they'll find grounds," Eleanor said quietly. "But a married couple maintaining an active household and working ranch is harder to challenge. The law on family occupancy is clearer." He turned and looked at her. There was a question in his eyes that he wasn't asking out loud. "I'm not suggesting anything," she said, before he could misread her. "I'm telling you what the document says. What you do with it is yours to decide." He nodded slowly. Then he sat back down and pulled the lamp closer. They worked at the table for the next 2 hours, he knowing the land and its history, she knowing how to organize a written record. She drafted notes in her clear, steady hand while he dictated the facts, the dates, the improvements made to the property, the neighbors who could provide witness to active occupation. They worked efficiently and without awkwardness, like two people who had been doing this for years. Near midnight, he set down his pen and said, unprompted, "My father was a good man. He trusted a company that told him they were building something for the whole valley. They weren't." He paused. "I've been trying to hold what he built. Some days it feels like holding water." Eleanor thought about what to say and chose honesty. "My first placement after the orphanage was with a woman named Mrs. Carroll in Atchison. She was kind to me for exactly 3 weeks. Then she decided I wasn't the right fit and sent me back." She smoothed the corner of a document. "For years I believed I had done something wrong. Something in me." Caleb was quiet. "I don't think that anymore," she said. "Good," he said, simply, like he meant it. 3 days later, a letter arrived addressed to Miss Eleanor Marsh. The return address was Denver, Colorado. It was signed, "Daniel Marsh, your brother." Eleanor had believed she was the last of her family. Not with bitterness, she had simply organized her life around that fact the way you organize a house around the rooms it has, not the rooms you wish it had. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the letter open in front of her, not reading it again. She had already read it 3 times, but simply sitting with what it meant. The handwriting was careful and slightly formal, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write well and was proud of it. He said he was 27. He said he had been placed with a family in Colorado after their mother passed, that they had carried a different name by then, that he had not known where Eleanor went. He said he had been looking in a slow and uncertain way for years. Caleb found her there when he came in from the morning work. He saw the letter, saw her face, and said nothing immediately. He poured himself coffee, sat down at the opposite end of the table, and waited. "I have a brother," she said. The words felt strange, not unwelcome, but large, the way unfamiliar words feel in the mouth before you're used to them. He said, "Is that good or hard?" "Both," she said. "I don't know him, but he looked for you." She looked at Caleb. "Yes," she said. "He did." He nodded once, the way he nodded when something made sense to him, and drank his coffee. That afternoon he stayed closer to the house than usual. Not hovering, he was never a man who hovered, but present, nearby, doing work that happened to keep him within earshot. She noticed. She appreciated it without remarking on it. In the late afternoon, she went out to the garden, which was beginning to show real signs of what it would become. Green shoots along the south row. The dark soil turned and richened. She sat in the dirt beside it and let herself feel, privately, the complicated fullness of the day. She was not a woman who cried easily, but her eyes were bright when Caleb came and sat beside her. Not on the porch, not on a fence rail, but in the dirt just beside her, without ceremony or explanation. They sat until the sun was nearly down. That evening she read parts of Daniel's letter aloud over supper. Caleb listened to every word. When she finished, he said, "Write him back. Tell him you're settled and well." Together, they drafted the reply. Neither of them spoke about what settled meant, but neither of them looked away from it either. A week later, Tom found boot prints near the eastern boundary, fresh, deliberate. in a place no honest man had reason to stand. Whitmore called it a community forum. He had arranged it at the Dust Creek Assembly Hall on a Thursday evening, with printed notices posted at the feed store, the post office, and the church door. The notices described a historic opportunity for regional development and invited all interested landowners and citizens to attend. Caleb sat through the first 20 minutes in silence, arms folded, listening as Whitmore stood at the front of the hall and explained, with charts, with figures, with the careful language of a man who had done this many times in many towns, why a rail corridor through the valley would raise property values, bring new commerce, and modernize a region that had been, he said gently, left behind by progress. Several people in the room looked thoughtful. A few looked hopeful. Caleb recognized the effect. He had seen it before, in the year after his father signed that first agreement, when the company men had used the same kind of language and left behind the same kind of wreckage. Whitmore paused for questions. A farmer named Briggs asked about compensation rates. A woman from the south end of the valley asked about the timeline. Then Whitmore looked toward Caleb with a particular practiced look, the look of a man who wants the room to see that the only person resisting is one difficult individual. Eleanor stood up. She stood quietly, without drama, in the third row. She did not raise her voice. She asked what would happen to families whose land sat at the center of the corridor. She asked about the legal provisions for continuous occupancy protections. She asked about the historical precedent from similar projects in Kansas and New Mexico, where she understood that ranching families had ultimately lost properties they had worked for generations. She asked these questions one at a time, clearly, and waited for answers. Whitmore gave smooth non-answers. But the room had shifted. People who had been nodding were now listening differently. On the walk home, under a wide-open sky thick with stars, Caleb walked beside her without speaking for a long time. The night was warm and dry, the kind of Texas night that felt endless. Their boots made the same sound on the packed earth road. Then he reached over, without looking at her, and took her hand. He held it for the rest of the walk home. Neither of them said a word about it. Neither of them needed to. The legal filing came through on a Wednesday morning. Tom rode into town and brought it back with the other post, setting it on the kitchen table without ceremony. Caleb read it standing up, still in his work coat. Then he set it down, let out a long, slow breath, and looked out the window. Whitmore's consortium had withdrawn its challenge. The occupancy documentation, prepared carefully and filed before the deadline, held without dispute. The Holt Ranch, all of it, every acre his father had built and worried over and loved, was secure. Tom made a small sound from the doorway that might have been a cheer, compressed into one syllable from a man not given to cheering. Caleb nodded once. Then he went outside and stood in the yard for a while, looking at the land the way a man looks at something he almost lost. Eleanor found him there. She stood beside him and looked at the same land, the flat, wide, extraordinary country with its dry grasses and enormous sky. She had arrived here not knowing what she was walking into. She had not chosen this place the way people usually choose places. And yet, a few days later, another letter arrived from Denver. Daniel Marsh was traveling west. He asked, carefully and with evident uncertainty about his welcome, whether there was any chance he might visit before summer's end. Eleanor brought the letter to Caleb. He read it, thought about it, said, "Tell him he's welcome here." She looked at him. The morning light was behind him, and the yard was quiet except for the sound of the horses moving in the near pasture and the wind through the cottonwood leaves. He looked back at her, not with the guarded, braced expression he had worn at the train station, but open, the way a door is open when someone inside has decided there is no longer a reason to keep it shut. "Do you want to stay?" he asked. "Not because of any of the rest of it. Not the land or the filing or anything practical. Because I want to know what you want." Eleanor looked at the garden along the south wall of the house, the garden she had planted from nothing, that was now green and growing and full of what the season would bring. She looked at the kitchen where she had learned the geography of another person's life. She looked at the man standing in the yard asking her, sincerely, what she wanted. "Yes," she said, "I want to stay." Tom, coming out of the barn with a halter over his shoulder, caught sight of them from across the yard. He turned quietly around and went back the way he came, smiling to himself. That evening Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and wrote a short letter. She was not sure exactly who it was addressed to, Perhaps to the younger version of herself who had traveled 2 days by train to a stranger's ranch with a single worn suitcase and the quiet, terrifying hope that this time, finally, someone would let her stay. She wrote, "I found a place I belong, and no one sent me away."